go 3, 2, 1.
You're on.
You're on.
Okay.
Oh, I can't believe it.
Yeah, sure.
Wow.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming here today for the first day of our retreat this weekend. This is a special event, special in a way because this is our very first live broadcast on our Facebook page live. We're also broadcasting on the Facebook page for Urban Dharma in Asheville, North Carolina. So this is the center where Dr. Lai is the spiritual director and founder. And so we're very, very grateful that they could spare him for this weekend retreat. Kindness, compassion, and the awakened heart. So I think a little bit of housekeeping. If you ever feel uncomfortable or need to get up and walk around, please feel free. I think you all know where the bathrooms are. And the schedule is from 10 to 1, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back from 3 to 5. And we may have, depending on how it goes, other breaks as well. Anything else I should say?
That's it.
Okay, thank you.
So good morning to all of you. Again, good to see you this morning. Thank you for coming last night, if you were here, and thank you for coming this morning. Then also, as Melissa mentioned, this is somewhat exciting for ABS, the Ecumenical Buddhist Society of Little Rock. It's the first live streaming that we're doing for a program here. And also, of course, it's also being live streamed. So on the Urban Dharma North Carolina Facebook page as well. So if you're watching from elsewhere, you're probably watching from one or the other of these two Facebook pages. We hope that the battery for the phones are going to last through the first session. If we suddenly disappear and you're out there, oh well.
Try the other side.
One of the core teachings of the Buddha is that all phenomena, all things are marked by the characteristic of inconstancy or impermanence. So it's inconstant. So this today and tomorrow we're going to spend some time on this topic: kindness, compassion, and the awakened heart. I am thinking, I'm hoping that we would get some time to not just, in my case, talking, your case, listening, and sometimes, hopefully, I'll also listen as you talk. But beyond that, perhaps we can do some sitting together. Because really, until we go from listening to contemplating and then to meditating, of course these words all have different meanings to different people, but until we move from the listening or the studying part into the contemplating part, and then through contemplation, then also move into meditating. The Dharma is not really going to penetrate our hearts. So the Buddha said that these are the three modes of learning. He talked about how certain insights or acumen will get developed when we listen, which is the primary mode of learning way back when. There weren't books, people listen to the teachings. So it's called listening and then contemplating. So contemplating, so obviously in listening, it's, you have to listen in a certain way. And so in some instructions, it gives the example of a pot or a container. So it says that when we listen, we should be free from these three faults. Yeah, some of you must be quite familiar with this. The first fault is that this container that you're trying to fill should not be turned upside down. So meaning we might be physically present and the words are kind of occurring, but somehow there's an obstacle to actually receiving because you're physically present, but the opening is turned upside down. And so no matter how much someone's pouring, nothing is going to get it. And then the second fault is that it's a leaky container. So now the mouth is on the right side up, but it's leaky. And so no matter how much you pour, it's not going to retain. It's going to flow out. So that's the second fault. And then the third fault, it says, is when the container itself is unclean, or even worse, it's poisonous. So then, all this good stuff that you hope to retain and keep, it is not it's keeping, it's not leaking out, but now it has contaminated the good stuff. And so they're referring to kind of the presence of strong, mistaken, erroneous views or understandings that get all mixed up. What we're hearing, what we're listening to. So that's kind of like we should be careful to be free from these three faults when we're listening. And I also want to say something about this part about listening, and now we are studying, and now we're reading. Of course, we know that historically, in the Buddha's, in his own time, he never wrote anything down, but I believe that he knew how to write because he was a prince, or at least son of a very powerful man. And so it's said that he was well educated, and he probably learned how to write, but he did not write anything. And also his immediate disciples did not write down anything either. What they did do, according to the records, is that right after the death of the Buddha, a group of 500 of his disciples gathered for the duration of 3 months during the rains retreat. And over 3 months, it said that they all gathered together and they listened to what people remembered the Buddha taught. According to this account, primarily 3 main students kind of repeated a lot of what the Buddha taught, and the rest that were there kind of served as verifiers and said, yes, either yes, I was there and I heard that too, or yes, this would be consistent with what I know, the Buddha taught. And so then at the end of the 3 months, there was a consensus of like, okay, this is what we all heard him teach, and we will agree as a community that this is what he taught. And then from there, the tradition is said kind of spread out even further post the passing of the Buddha. Now, I think then it went on for a few hundred years before the first instance of this oral tradition being committed to text, to writing. Now, in the context of India of that time, it is not strange at all. Because in India, the most sacred subjects is so sacred that it should not be turned into writing. And in fact, for example, the most holy of scriptures for Hindus, the Veda, it said that the Veda is fundamentally sound. Not text, not written text. It's fundamentally sound. And so even if you write all those sounds down, and print it, and you say, oh, I have the Veda, they're like, that's not the Veda. That's a copy of the Veda, but that's not the Veda. The Veda is necessarily and fundamentally sound. And so during the Buddhist time, when people did write, they wrote mundane things, like statecraft, like business transactions, mostly. So then nothing was recorded in writing until a few hundred years later, and we're told that a king, King Ashoka, was faced with a situation, according to this account, that there were a lot of different opinions and controversies over, once again, what the Buddha taught and did not teach. And apparently there were a lot of quote-unquote heresies, however you want to translate the word, or wrong views. And as a righteous Buddhist king, he saw it as his responsibility to kind of settle this. And he apparently advocated the writing down of this oral tradition. And so a great project ensued whereby these were all written down. And as far as I know, that's the first kind of formal occasion. Probably somewhere along the way, different groups, different individuals were writing certain things down, but as a concerted effort by the Buddhist community, it's said to be King Ashoka's time. And that's probably 2nd century BC, somewhere around there, I think, Ashoka. Buddha was maybe 5th century.
Buddha was what century?
Buddha
Which century?
was probably 5th BC, 5th century, 6th century, somewhere around there. And Ashoka was maybe 2nd, somewhere around there, 2nd, 3rd. So, 300 years later. Now, I think some of us are already thinking, well, is that reliable? Right? You're like 300 years later, 200 years later, wow, is that reliable? So let's dwell on that a little bit. Why do you think it would even trigger that in you? If it did, I don't know. Maybe I'm just projecting. Let's
Because of the limitations of memory?
Because of the limitations of memory, okay. So we fear that, we fear what? So let's tease that out.
Things weren't repeated orally exactly right, and over time, sort of like the telephone game.
Right, so then we think of the telephone game, okay, yeah. Other?
We want something authoritative to tell us the truth.
Yeah, so
that
we
can rely on.
Yeah, so then we're like, well, that's not so authoritative, right? It wasn't written down until a few hundred years later, and what Maha told me 2 weeks ago, I can't even remember exactly what she said, and this is 300 years later. Okay, so what else, Like, why would it trigger an immediate kind of like, what? You mean 300 years later before they wrote it down?
So, like in recent civilization, we depend on others to remember things. So that's how they envision way back.
Right.
That's how they knowledge
Mhm.
just by rote memory exactly how it is.
Right. So that's like in answer to like, well, actually, people's memories were a lot better compared to now. For me, for sure, I know that. When I was 15, I have at least 40 names and 40 phone numbers that I could link in my head. Now, what is my phone number? Let me see, check with my iPhone and see what it says. But that kind of immediate suspicion of fear, I think part of that comes from what is our cultural baggage?
We're a book culture.
We're a book culture. We're a book-based culture. We're a text-based culture. And more so the holy book. Even if we have walked away from the holy book, or like the holy book is a great book, but not holy, But still, the cult of the book, so to say, right?
Yeah.
So we trust
The written word.
the written word more than the spoken word. Yes.
We're also sometimes obsessed with finding one single cause or one source.
Looking for one source, looking for a source that you can kind of trace all the way to the horse's mouth or to Sid's mouth. Yeah. Yes.
I know sometimes in Christianity, the farther from the source, the more corrupt it is.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll hear like Eastern Orthodox say that their texts are closer
Yes.
and more accurate.
Right.
And the farther they get away.
Right. So a fear of corruption.
Translations.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So when we say a fear of corruption, so we are assuming certain things. Right? The corruptibility of memory, the corruptibility of intentions, and all of that. Okay? And then somehow, if we wrote it down, right? Of course, there are very practical reasons for that, right? I mean, they'll say, if your supervisor starts saying things that just don't, you want to write it down, have a paper trail, right? You can go back to, no reference to current happenings. But, there's, good reason, of course, right? But I want us to kind of spend a little bit thinking about this because, and so here I'm not going to be that orthodox. I want to stir things up a little bit and say, and what happens as well when we have things written down?
Well, I was thinking of one thing, is the scientific process of peer review and so forth, that you don't even publish things unless your peers agree that it's true, because people lie in writing all the time.
Yeah, people lie, right? Oh, yeah.
So, I mean,
especially
that
now,
faith
everyone
is-
gets to publish whatever they want to publish.
Yeah.
Right?
That faith is completely invalid.
Yeah. But what happens when things get written down? Let's say, okay, now let's try to go back in time, in Ashoka's time. So we are on the eve of that decision being made, and let's say we are all born again, born many times Buddhists, and we say, let's pretend we were a little bit kind of agnostic about the whole thing. No strong feelings one way or the other. We're like, okay, it's not really our thing, but we don't think it's the end of the world that they would write it down. Because you could imagine there were some saying, no, this is not our way. We don't write these things down. And in fact, the Hindus didn't write it down until like at least 1,000 years later. Yeah, they're just, they're just like, do whatever they want. These are heresies in any case, to the Buddhists. They didn't, actually I think they said that the Veda wasn't really written down until the British came. Because the British wanted everything written down.
Wow.
because the queen needed to know, you know, how many tigers, how many elephants, and how many Vedas she owns, or the king then. And so, you know, census and everything needs to be documented and everything, you know. And apparently then they send people around India looking for different oral recitations of the Veda. And so the thing about the memory, what's interesting is like they found very little discrepancy between communities in north, south, in the middle of nowhere, no contact. It was all, the devices that they use for memorization, it's just, we wouldn't even imagine. But that's a topic for some other day. But here, let's say we go back, okay? So we are agnostic to the whole thing. Now, after it's written down, the whole project is over, maybe like, you know, 20 years later. Let's try to imagine what issues might now surface. Interpretation, but maybe interpretation even. What about interpretation?
I think that once you write it down, it becomes official, and everything else is not.
Yeah, of course, you have privileged this as official, okay. And the Buddhists also did the same kind of memorization tricks or techniques that the Hindus use, and so they were able to kind of like recite pages and pages. What eventually became pages and pages. You know, they recited all of that. These are the Banakas, the professional reciters or memorizers. That was always in the monastic community designated groups that memorize all of this. Okay, now all that they know is now written down. Okay, now.
I guess once you write it down, like if I knew my password for my Wi-Fi, I wrote it down. I don't have to remember it. I just need to remember where I put it. So the reliance on what the knowledge is in a certain place.
Right.
That I would retrieve it. I know where it is, but not as much as.
Yes. Right. So then the loss of that for sure. Right? You kind of have this sense, perhaps false sense of like, oh, it's on the shelf. I can always go look it up. Right? But what else? Like, how about I want to hint in the direction of our attitude to the teachings?
What about it becomes more of an object? So then it's open to like the ownership you mentioned with the queen, you know. But it's more like it's this piece of paper. This is the object.
Okay, it becomes an object, sure. And what happens when we objectify in this case? Becomes a burden, yes.
Your mind gets too involved versus feeling.
Too involved versus the heart, yes, possible, but too involved in what way?
Is it more that it's more theoretical?
More theoretical. Here's what I'm trying to kind of go. I mean, all of this, you know, is good. One of the consequences of that is now suddenly you go, wait, book 7, chapter 4, line 6 says this. Book 9, chapter 3, verse 42 says that. Suddenly, you have quote-unquote contradictions, right? Quote-unquote contradictions. Your relationship to what was an oral text actually changes quite dramatically when it becomes a written text. You begin to scrutinize the text in ways that, I would argue, the Buddha never meant for us to do. We turn into wordsmithing, splicing, cutting away the ins and the outs, and then suddenly needing to harmonize this and that, and explain away ambiguities, and explain away. But you see, all these teachings were given by the Buddha over 45 years to different people, different places, for different needs. that answered fundamental questions, but circumstances changed. So even though there were Barnacles memorizing huge chunks, for a few hundred years, Buddhists didn't have the burden of wasting time in activity that is pointless from the perspective of practicing the Dharma, which is arguing over the meanings of words. In the sense of kind of the heart goes out, but it's not, of course, it's not just about feeling either, but suddenly Buddhists now, a whole other class of Buddhist professionals emerge in analyzing to death without end all these words. And then the immediacy of those teachings kind of goes away. And then we start reading the canon as if there was an editor, there was an author, when in fact these were all in different moments. In the immediacy of the moment, the Buddha said, you should consider da, da, da. For the first few hundred years, going back to the first listening with the 500, see, if they were concerned about capturing every word the Buddha said, they would have written. And not just that, capturing every word that the Buddha said so that each word can be compared to another word, compared to another word, compared to another word, then they would have written it down. But rather, what they wanted to do was, do we all agree on what's the texture of, what's the feel of, what is the approach of our master? Yes, they assigned some professional memorizers. Okay, you all go memorize, but these memorizers weren't necessarily the teachers that were teaching in the communities. Yeah? So the teachers that did go out to teach would teach based on what their heart has seen through their application of the Buddha's teachings, rather than mastery of the canon. Right? And so they taught their communities that way. Then they didn't get caught up in words and comparing words and contrasting words and counter-referencing words and footnoting words and and on and on and on and on. Because the Buddha's teachings were never meant for that purpose. But, a side effect of writing it down is really an attitude to the teachings that, if your task is not, like formally to transmit the teachings and to preserve the teachings, it's really kind of, life is short. So these days, we are exposed to so much information. Not even counting information that is obviously useless and we can't do anything with. Just even Buddhist information. We're exposed to so much information. And then we have this culture, this baggage of the more information, the better. Because we don't trust when people, we feel that information is being withheld. We think it's definitely sinister. And we have good reasons to think that too. I'm not saying we don't have, but if we carry that unconsciously, unaware, into the way we approach learning the Dharma, we would find that, maybe 20 years later, all we're doing is gathering information. I think many of us, I have said before, I think many of us probably have more information about different aspects of Buddhist teachings than even someone like Milarepa. In that sense, you don't need more information. So between the listening and the contemplating, there's a disconnect to the taking to heart. The taking to heart, the contemplating, is basically, okay, now we have learned, we have listened, we have studied. And then we kind of, you can't take the whole chunk, so you take one aspect, and then you sit down. Let the mind be somewhat focused, and then so we read something like impatience is an obstacle. So now, because we are, spiritual types, so immediately we're like, oh yeah, impatience is an obstacle. And, we think we got it, right? But we really need to contemplate. So now sit down and think, try to recall the last instance of being impatient. Then yes, you kind of bring up that memory. And then as you bring up the memory, not like thinking, in that sense, kind of feeling that anxiety that arises with the impatience. And then really pay attention to the feel of that, the texture of that feeling. Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it coarse? Is it subtle? Is it invigorating? Maybe it is. And if it is invigorating, don't worry about what the Buddha said, what the teacher said. Pay attention. Why does impatience invigorate you? And when I say why, I don't mean come up with a narrative. I mean like, okay, it's invigorating. So what do I like about that? If you can find some reason to like impatience, you are entitled to it. The Buddha said that actually it's heavy. But don't let that be your conclusion. So you have to contemplate. I think a lot of us say, I don't know, like after several years of doing this, I don't feel like it's, because I think we're not really doing it yet. We have this attitude of, how soon can I fall along party lines? Now that I've signed up for the Buddhist party, I'm a card-carrying member now. So the sooner I can fall in line with, yes, impatience is an obstacle, yay. Right? I have reached the next level of this club. And the next level of this club. And the next level of this club. Then it's about building an identity. And whenever self is built on whatever that is inconstant, the result is dukkha, suffering. But instead, so actually we should only take little chunks of teachings. So now, go home. Right, I want to get my money's worth, But really, just take one line, you know. Don't be so quick to say, yeah, anger is bad. I don't know. You know, have a certain kind of curiosity, not argumentative mind. I don't think anger is bad. Come on, right? Not that kind of like, you know. I mean, if you come for the sake of arguing, then you know, well, if you can find someone to argue with you, then you got your money's worth. But if you come really to kind of let it see if this is true, you know, have a certain curiosity, have a certain kind of, yeah, curiosity of a child, like why? Not in the annoying way, why? You know, when the child figures out, you know, that they could do that to get to the parents, you know, then that becomes a strategy. But really, that kind of curiosity, you know. So the Tibetan example, they said, you know, it's applied in different contexts, but I think equally applies. They say, you know, be like a child entering like a temple, which to translate that culture, it means like, you know, like going to the mall. But people don't go to the mall anymore, I think. Going to whatever, right? To the museum or, because going to the temple in the context of Tibet, you know, the temple and the royal palace are the most fancy places in that society. So going to the temple has a certain attraction. Everything is colorful. Everything is beautiful. So a child that goes into this space, you know, wow. And so we should have that kind of attitude to the teachings when we listen.
So is the operative word their experience?
Yeah.
So you experience the
To take,
impatient,
yeah.
and you're not thinking of the impatience, but you're
Correct.
Experiencing it.
Experiencing it, and then applying that insight into that experience. The insight is the information that we gathered from the teachings, and let there be kind of a light to shine onto the experience that we bring up. Then hopefully the idea is, when the next time this experience turns up, that light can come on instantly. But now, not so quickly, not so instantly. So then now, let's say, let's pretend, you know, that from now on, all the Buddhist retreats will just be, you come, you gather, you prepare yourself, and then you're given a one-liner. It's like, okay, end of program, you know, and then you just go, yeah? And then what you have to do is you have to bring up past memories for training, and that's what we call practice. So you train, so you contemplate. And then when you contemplate and you reach a conclusion, right? And the conclusion is, yes, it's heavy. But don't just let that word, you know, kind of like, you know, on a gut deep level, you know what that heaviness means, right? Then now, move away from that experience. Now sit with the heaviness. That's when we're transitioning into meditation. Sit with the heaviness now. And sit, and then let go of the heaviness. And then feel the And then you have a memory of the weight. You have a memory of the relinquishing of the weight. And then you rest. You rest in the releasing. But you cannot rush into the releasing if you don't hold the heaviness for a while in a controlled environment, which is what meditation is. It's a controlled environment for the kind of experiences that we will and we need to have outside of controlled environment. And then you feel the lightness and the ease that you settle into. when you release that burden. And then when you find yourself kind of fading from begin with insight, reach a certain conclusion, and rest in that state. The resting in the state is not just a resting, it's actually letting that sink in, sink in, sink in, sink in, sink in. That's when you are rewiring those networks, if you want to use that language, the pseudo neuroscience language of networks, right? The way your chemicals might be shooting or whatever. You are rerouting that. If your approach to all of this is secular based and not Buddhist religion based.
You said from insight to resting in.
Resting in the insight.
Resting in the
insight that has been gained from the analytical, from the contemplation. You rest as in you stay with it. So that's also called placement. You stay in that place so that you don't move from it. Now, of course, all of this needs the preparation of the more conventional way of thinking of first calm abiding, then insight. And so it's sort of like first calm abiding, then insight. Insight gives rise to insight, or analytical or contemplation gives rise to insight, and then let that insight sink in by going back to non-analytical, by just staying with that weight, as well as staying with the lightness. And when we begin to stay with the weight and stay with the lightness, you see how you're not trying to always stay in lightness. Because then we're just chasing, drug-induced or meditation-induced bliss. We also begin to learn the nature of that weight. Because inevitably, you have to carry that weight at some point, until you are Sid, with a halo. The weight is going to come. So what actually we're doing with meditation then is to also know, to understand the nature of the entanglement, the nature of the weight. How weighty it gets, how heavy. But then, no matter how heavy it is, it also has certain characteristics to it, which is it is inconstant, it is not self, and whatever pertains to self involves dukkha. These three characteristics.
Did you say the three characteristics once more?
Inconstancy or impermanence is the more usual word that you come across. I prefer inconstant. Not self, not pertaining to self. And whenever self is involved, dukkha turns up. So suffering. So these are called the three characteristics. Dukkha, anitya or anicca, and anatta or anatman. Again, these three things, any rudimentary college textbook or high school textbook on world religions will give it to you. Buddhists believe in X, Y, Z. And you read about this. And then you think, oh, well, I'm Buddhist, so I should believe it. Believing in. Yes?
So, practically speaking, you talked about the impatience. It's all, if you perceive difficulties as you're meditating, and I'm finding myself that if I meditate, any kind of heaviness or difficulty associated with my back muscles tensing up a little bit, and that's how I know that it's coming.
Right.
And the way I would examine it from a distance is I would associate all the difficult things with the
Right.
effect.
Right.
on my
You see
muscles.
how it happens
Right.
together.
Blend them together, and then I start just thinking about letting go. And the difficulty is a little bit more objective, but I don't know whether that's how you want
Yes.
to release it. When you say hold it, release your. It's an analog of the heaviness
Sure.
that's in my back, and it actually feels pleasant or neutral
Yes.
as it begins to release, and that
Yes.
difficulty doesn't happen.
Yes, perfect. Sometimes the intervention can come from the mind, heart side. Sometimes the intervention has to come from the body side. So the tenseness, if you cannot release the anger that is, occurring simultaneous with the tensing of certain muscles, try, nudging the muscles. Try breathing deep. It's often the case when anger arises, breath is shallow. So then you can intervene by breathing deeply, right? Or some intervention might involve running, although they're not in traditional Buddhist texts. But you experiment, you play with it, you experiment with it. I would even say, okay, if you're a gardener, okay, now time to go garden. But not as a distraction. I mean, of course, we could use distraction. Let's not be so extreme. Sometimes we simply need a distraction. But you could also use it not as a distraction, but that when you are gardening, you move away from feeding the narrative that's making you upset. Right? And your hands are involved, and then you want to have an eye towards, okay, now how does it feel like? What is the texture of this experience now? And then you can compare. And then if you actually, you're gardening as a form of meditation, then in a way, yes, you have to let go of your gardening tools when you have reached a conclusion, and maybe sit next to your tomato bush, and let it settle. That's the placement. And let it settle and say, this is the insight that has arisen. I'm going to let it settle. I'm going to let it settle. So Buddha's teachings, he taught it for this reason. But inevitably, in the last 2,500 years, a lot of things happened. Then analysis and really studying, mastering text and all of that, I mean, I personally spend time doing that. I like that. I'll have 4 translations open on the table, and 3 commentaries if I can get, and I like wordsmithing and splicing words and going, oh, look at this word here, all of that. But we could very easily get carried away and think, that's what it is about. And that's also when, kind of sectarian stuff and arguments about differences and all of that, and we're like, wow, the Buddha said da-da-da. Well, for every quote that you can marshal up, someone else can marshal up 7 other quotes. That's, Buddha said, I have only taught 2 things. Dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. Suffering and the cessation of suffering. Towards the end of his life, he said this. At the beginning of his teaching life, he said, dukkha, recognize dukkha. Dukkha has a source, and that's grasping, abandon, relinquish, grasping. And then the end of dukkha, there is such a thing as end of dukkha. And he said, experience that. Taste that. Experience that. And then there is a way to experience that. Develop develop that. By develop, he doesn't mean go reinvent the wheel. Yesterday I had an opportunity to talk about this with one of you. And by develop, and I find that verb to be most interesting. Like with the Four Noble Truths, with every of these truths, there is a verb given. And so we, again, you know, we think Four Noble Truths, oh yes, you know, again, you go back to your high school or your college textbooks, you know, Buddhists believe in the Four Noble Truths. Then you're like, okay, but no, with regards to the Four Noble Truths, the verb is not to believe. For each of the truths, there is a specific verb. The truth of suffering, or dukkha, recognize. The truth of cause of suffering, relinquish, abandon. And to the truth of the end of suffering, the cessation of suffering, experience. To the truth of the path, the method, very interesting word, develop. To develop. So as I said, to develop doesn't mean go make it up yourself. But so here is, I feel, also some of the problems that might arise when we take the expression of the path quite literally. I mean, not so literally that we think it's you know, like Markham or 3rd Street, you know. But even like the analogy sometimes gets us in trouble. We think that, you know, there is somehow a mental or spiritual path that exists, you know, somewhere here. And then now, you know, Aisha started on the path earlier, and she said, after 30 minutes or 3 years, look out for the elephant on the right. You know, and right, and then Cheryl comes along, you know, and doesn't find any elephants, and think, wait, am I doing this right or not? You know, we think that there should be an elephant there. Well, maybe, maybe not, because that's not. So the path. Actually, the verb there, actually, I find it interesting, and now I'm wordsmithing, I'm splicing words. Maybe the Buddha never meant it that way, but, you know, when useful, we could do that. It's like, I think it's interesting, it doesn't just say walk the path. Then it's a much more passive task. Okay, well, I'm on the path now, just keep walking, you know. And maybe along the way there's some dragons to slay, and then maybe some kittens to, you know, pet, and, you know, watch out for potholes. But he says to develop. So that means for each of us, yeah, there are, you know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but for each of us, we have to take responsibility. And not just take responsibility like you have to take responsibility, young man, you know, but rather that don't surrender too much of your process to someone else. Trust your process and pay attention how it's unfolding. Now, it could unfold in the wrong direction. That's why we need guides. But in the end, the guides are just guides. They can't do the journey for you. They themselves are on the journey, but their journey is not going to be identical to yours. We all enter this at different points, and the path is not a single path that, you know, we kind of walk on and expect to see the same things along the way. So to develop the path. Questions or comments? Just before we get into the topic. This is important, you know. Not knowing how to learn.
Yeah, I think like words limit you as to how probably Buddha described it, because like if you talks about the impermanence as a cause for, you know, your challenges and grasp in the permanence of things. You really have to experience it.
Yeah.
Even the word experience is limiting.
Right, right.
Because you have to feel it. Or
Yeah,
something.
take it to heart, feel it, taking it
Yeah.
to your process. Yeah. So Buddha said, you know, rely on the meaning and not on the words. The four reliances. Yeah, we have this. But these words were probably said before anything was written down. Even then, he said. Then how much more we should not? Well, this book says this book says this book says this book says this, you know, what about this, what about that? And then get all tangled up, you know, quoting chapter and verse. This is not Buddha's tradition. Quoting chapter and verse. Yes.
So you're talking about bhavana,
Uh-huh.
always like cultivation.
Cultivation,
I mean,
right, right.
Well, it is a sense of you're trying to grow something,
Yeah,
and it takes a long time.
it takes a long time.
And
Yeah,
there's
that's a good
lot that
bhavana.
happens along the way.
Means to cultivate. And in fact, in Chinese, they call practitioners cultivators. 行者修行, to cultivate. It also has a connotation of actually traveler, 行. 修 is to cultivate. So it's the cultivator walker. So walking, not driving, not skateboarding, definitely not flying. Walk. Something about pilgrimage, walking. There's something different when your where you contact the earth is contacting every step of it. Driving through the country and walking across the country are two different experiences. When I have time and I walk to work, you know, my way to work is a completely different experience. So, cultivator walker is the compound for the Chinese for what we call practitioner. Which, as Doug pointed out, the Pali, is bhavana, which means to cultivate. Yes.
It sounds like the distinction that you're making is two different attitudes toward the path, right? So one attitude being there is one path for everyone, and we just have to figure out what that is. And then the other attitude
Right.
is an individualized, personalized relationship to it.
Yes. Now, teachings are clear. Or at least we want the teachings to be clear. But the teachings themselves are not the path yet. You have to take that into your own experience. So the Tibetan word that we translate as practice is nyamlen. Nyam is experiences. Take these experiences kind of into our lives.
What would be the Sanskrit word for practice?
Bhavana, cultivate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, to cultivate. So sometimes we mistake, you know, the teachings and we say that's the path. No, that is a necessary, you know, place to have, necessary to have the teachings. So on the teaching side, I think it's important that we seek clarity there. So I also don't want to, you know, this is my issues. I also don't want, I'm not comfortable with like, everything is just good, you know, take some here, take some there. Not my way. I mean, if it is your way, it's working for you, no judgment. It's just, that's not my way, and also, you know. So I do believe that it's important to seek clarity in whatever teachings you get, whatever information you're getting, because that set of information, that set of teachings, if it's been passed down till now, over time, I also believe not only corruption can come in, but fine-tuning. We could go either way. So in a way, you could say we need to trust the wider wisdom that has accumulated, the wisdom of experience. I think in part that's what we mean when we talk about lineage. One view of lineage is that the further you are from the source, the worse it has gotten. So that's a very kind of doomsday view, right? Everything is just going to hell. It's a matter of how quickly. Interesting statement. I don't know if we have actualized that, but that's at least the aspiration. So in the sense of, we can trust, so a set of teachings, there's a kind of wisdom that has arisen collectively. So there are good things, and so we want to seek clarity from within that system, and so that then we know what are the take-home lessons. Because if we are not careful, because of our own baggage, now especially when like two cultures are involved, we might just go cherry pick. So when I was still teaching at the university, I say to students, I say, often we think that, we come here and we think that, the class, the professor or whoever is going to help me get answers to the questions that I have about this or that. I said, yeah, on some level that's what's going on, but at least in the humanities, maybe in mathematics and all that, that's probably the main focus, I don't know. But I said in the humanities, my feeling is that that's a preliminary step, that your teacher, the class, or the course is now getting you some answers to questions that you have, but more importantly is helping you to reformulate your questions. When you start reformulating your questions, then I see that something is now really working. Because we believe so much in the questions that we ask that we don't even ask questions of those questions. So we only want to get answers to those questions. Maybe that's not where the problem is. So whenever two cultures, the transmission of Buddhism now, so I feel that we should pay close attention to the original context in which these teachings are given and expressed. The Dharma is timeless, but how the Dharma is expressed is always bound in time and space. How can we ignore that? If we ignore that, we walk away with some really weird take-home lessons. And then we go apply that. But that's not the intended meaning. Yes?
Well, okay, there's a tension though between, like last night, you gave us this incredible thing that's how many hundreds of years old, that practice, right? So there's a tension between preserving
yes.
What's,
of course.
What's being handed down, and also.
Yes, of course.
So that's one problem.
Yeah. Not problem.
Well.
Wonderful tension.
Challenge, whatever, part of it. But then the second part for me is having confidence in my own experience. Like,
yes, that's important.
It's really hard.
That's important.
When am I doing it right all the time? Am I doing it right?
Yeah, that's really important, to have confidence in our own process, simultaneously knowing that we're confused and that's why we need guidance. Oh yeah. And that's the creative tension. And if you are true to that and not try to brush it away so that you will now become a perfect disciple, or stamp it out so that I'm a trailblazer, I'm an individual, I'm going to go and do it my way. No, don't settle into either of those two. Let that tension always be there and be aware of that tension. Yes.
This makes me think about when, in the Thai forest tradition, Ajahn Sumedha was trying to start the monastery in England.
Uh-huh.
And of course, he was working with Ajahn Chah, who would come visit.
Yes.
And you know, of course, English monks, a lot of them, well, they're all converts. They were saying, well, we don't, you know, that old way is ridiculous, and we should do it this way, and we should do this. And what Ajahn Chah said was, do it the old way.
Yes.
And after you've done it the old way for a while, and you understand why it's working, why it's not working, then we'll change it.
Right. Right. And they wanted to, you know, create rules by committee or change rules by committee and say, well, come on, arms round in an English village, that doesn't work. You know, nobody's going to give you food. You know, the teacher's response is like, well, how do you know? Then, you know, 4 years later, teacher, nobody gave food. Okay, fine. Now you have 4 years of experience. Yeah. And it's that kind of change. So like with the ritual yesterday, right? For example, you know the collage of images? In the instruction it says, use a cushion that is white on one side and black on the other side. So I've done that ritual a little bit. And then over time I said, I don't know. I don't think that is what I want to reinforce. I know, you know, you're like, oh, you mean politically correct, da da da. But it matters to me. I don't want to reinforce that. I said it's fine in Asia, you know, when it's not so clear cut. There's no mapping of these two colors so instantly to the politics. You know, I'm not saying Asians are not prejudiced. They have their own, you know. Oh yeah, you know, like skin tone, the fairer, the better. It's there too, but they don't map so immediately to the political discourse of these two colors. Okay. So then we go deeper, right? So what is this whole black and white? It's how they symbolize virtue and non-virtue. So then I ask for images. So that's sort of like, you know, do it, feel it, you know.
But the form itself you preserve
Yes.
very, very, very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you preserve the form, and then you have to adapt. And part of that is I'm learning. I have to be, you know, honest and say, you know, there's a range of, you know, not surprising, attitudes to that. For me, my reference point is to, you know, one of my teachers. In fact, even among my teachers, there is a spectrum of attitudes. But the head of the order, I look at the way he handles, like ritual, you know. He talks about the precision and all of that, but at the same time, he's also not fundamentalist about that. He'll say, no, this doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. And again, my kind of professor tendencies, you know, I want like footnotes and endnotes to like what has happened there, you know. But then I see that with him, that's not his concern. Because I think, and this is kind of to segue into what we're going to talk about. It's the intention, the bodhicitta, that matters. Develop that. That will serve as a guide to how we change or don't change and all of that. Then of course many people will say to me, you cannot take that example from His Holiness because you don't have the bodhicitta of His Holiness. which is very true, of course. So I don't say, oh, well, you know, the head of the order is doing it, you know, so I'm going to do it. And it's not because, you know, of anything except that there is a vast difference between his bodhicitta and mine. But bodhicitta, the awakened mind, the awakened heart, we should focus on. Okay? Growing that, developing that. Then it will serve as a guide to all the other things that we need to do or want to do. Should we take a break? And yeah, 10 minutes or so, stretch a little bit.
Yeah.
It's stopped.
So thank you for giving us a shield of bodhicitta last night.
Uh-huh.